My name is Brian. We're going to talk a little bit about UX strategies for underperforming data products and apps. And I'm curious, real quick question, did anyone feel insulted when they saw the word underperforming? Because I told someone about this in the hall. It's like, wow, underperforming. I don't think anyone's going to show up for that. Did anyone feel like, oh, that's a stab? Because I think first thing we have to do is decide that we have a problem, right? It's like, hey, you got to know you got a problem before you could do anything about it. So hopefully we're all here because we think that we have some space for improvement on the stuff we're working on. So when I got into analytics, I started seeing these kinds of reports, right? Like Gartner's #1. This is 10 years ago. If you build it, they will come. And then there was another one like this. Cisco says 26% of surveys. 74% failure rate on that one. Gartner has this one. 60% of big data projects fail. And then they put out a correction. Oops, we meant 85% of projects fail. So we're spending a ton of money, and we're still failing with projects. I thought this was hilarious when I put out my article out about all these failure stories, and this guy hits reply. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, why is this so relevant to your work? It should not be relevant to your work, especially if you're the CEO. But he was admitting he had an issue there. So the theme with these articles that I've been collecting about failures and big data projects is technology in search of a problem. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. And the simplest thing I can probably boil my entire talk down to today, the magic bullet here, having a UX mindset or a designer's mindset is really about falling in love with the problem. And we spend a lot of time building assets and building stuff and making stuff, because a lot of us are makers. For engineers in here, we like to make things. And for designers, we like to create things. So really what it's about is falling in love with that problem and being able to really clearly define it so that you can align solutions around that. So what do we mean by underperforming? These are the typical types of problems I see with data products. They range from engagement to low utility or value to the user, usability and utility issues. You've all have seen this before when it's really difficult to get through something that you feel should be super simple. Attrition, so this is more for SaaS products, subscription services where they're losing customers because they don't need the service, or they don't understand the value of the service anymore. And sales difficulty, that's also another one, which can also just be an internal thing. So we're going to talk a little bit about having a data product mindset, even if you work on internal applications, so they're not commercial products that are for sale. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And my theory is we got to the moon, and people walked on the moon, so these kinds of problems should be things that we can solve. It shouldn't be that difficult. So a little bit about me. I have 2 lives. I'm a professional musician in Boston. That's my orange Bowron. And I'm also a designer, and these are some of the companies that I've worked for. And everyone, whether you're one of the tiny startups or one of the big companies here, everyone's struggling with this problem of user experience. It's not something that everyone is, there's these people that have totally figured it out, and they have these huge design teams. Even the ones with the really giant design teams are still having problems as well. So UX is this kind of mushy thing, but there are things we can do about it. There's things that you can learn without necessarily being a designer. And I think we've all, has anyone in here not said this before? I know good design when I see it. Pretty much everybody says that. So I like how Tim Brown, from the CEO of IDEO, phrases this. There's no black turtlenecks and magicry, and there's some art and there's creativity in the design process, but a lot of it is a rigorous study of the problem. And so these are things that engineers can do, business people can do, and really what a lot of what UX design can do for data products is where designers are facilitating the creation of better services. It's not so much that they go off and they create some magic thing and then they come back with it. It's more that they facilitate a conversation and a process that brings together technology, the people in charge of value delivery, which typically in a commercial side would be a product manager or a product owner. Again, even if it's not a product, that role of someone that has to own the delivery of the value back to the business, that trifecta is really important. And we'll go into that a little bit more. So When I talk about design today, we're not going to go heavy into data visualization. There's a lot of great stuff out there about that. I wanted to talk a little bit more holistically about experience, which includes data visualization. Largely, in the big data space, when I've worked on projects, it's about holding technology accountable. And what I mean by that is we're spending a lot of money and a lot of effort on really difficult stuff in the tech, and we're not always focused on what the problem is that it's going to solve and the outcomes that we want. So let's try to develop your sense here a little bit today. So I want to try to give you 10 problems or things that you can start to be aware of, and where I can, a quick solution. Not everything has a quick solution to it, but the first one is going to get into this team. You don't have all the right skills or people involved. So typically this is what the roster that I've found works really well. In terms of these roles here, again, they may not have these job titles, like they don't have to have this in their business card, but the roles are what's really important here. You may not be doing a data science project necessarily, but that's becoming more common with data products, obviously, so that role, it's no longer just engineering. So that's a person that may be even starting to become more of a product owner or product manager. You can see you can see which bullet on here I think is really important, and the one that's probably left out the most here, which are end users in that. So in terms of your minimum viable team, I would say early on, if you're going to try to either redesign a service or you're kind of saying, you know what, we need to go spend an effort to fix the design, the experience of this application we have. These 3 roles, again, they're not necessarily everyone's going to have that title, but they will keep each other in check, and I think these are important skill sets to have. We just talked about this a little bit, but David Alves from International Institute for Analytics just put out a white paper recently, and this was one of his quotes, and this is something I think he took from last year's Strata. But this analytics product manager, again, not someone that necessarily is in charge of revenue generation, but that person that can sit at the intersection of the business, delivering the business value, planning sprints, which features are going to go into the product, user testing, all of that, what's technically possible, translating stuff upwards, flying air cover downwards for your team to get their stuff done is really important. And part of this too is with the design thing, it's about diverse perspectives, because we all want to solve problems, and a data scientist or an engineer come at it from one perspective, and a business person's coming at it from another perspective. A designer's usually your strongest user advocate. So this team makeup and not having everyone that's the same is partly what's going to potentially deliver you the right experience if you have the right process for that. And one of my favorite stories about this is about Pacific Power and Light Company. They are a utility in Portland, and they had a 2-hour meeting to talk about how to get ice off of electricity poles. And this was a real challenge for them because it's very dangerous work, and in the middle of the winter, the linemen did not like having to crawl up these poles to knock ice off of the wires. And so they had a facilitator in this room, and they had the linemen together and a bunch of different people from the business trying to figure out what is a better way to solve this problem. And at one of the coffee breaks, one of the linesmen was getting some water or coffee or something, and he mentioned, he's like, man, just last week I got down to the bottom of the pole, and there's a black bear staring me in the face. It's like, this job sucks enough, and now I got to deal with bears. And someone overheard this and said, it's like, man, what if we could train the bears to crawl up the pole, and maybe they could shake the pole and the ice would fall off or something. And of course there were some snoods and snickers from the Rids, oh, come on, that's not going to work. And someone else is like, well, what if we put honey at the top of the poles, right? Because then the bears would climb up the poles and they could shake off the stuff. And it's like, that's crazy. How are we going to get honey at the top of the poles? And so someone else is like, well, we could get a helicopter and we could fly the honey out there and set it at the top of the pole, And then we could train the bears to go up, and we'd only do it in the winter so that they only come to the poles in the winter time. And then someone else is like, you know, I served in Vietnam, and he's like, the downwash from those helicopters is like really strong. Like it really pushes down. It's like, and the room stopped, and they realized that, and as far as I know, I'm not sure, I tried to validate this before I told you the story, they still do this today. They fly helicopters over the power lines, and the downwash from the blades knocks the ice off the poles. And they no longer have these guys climbing up icy poles and high-risk injury problems. And so the point of that is you have diverse people coming at stuff from different problems. You don't know where creativity might come from. And not, I'm sure some of you are like, oh, it's crazy, like we can't rely on that kind of thing. It's not always going to be like an amazing revelation kind of stuff like that, but if you have a process of including different minds, different perspectives in your design process, you might come across things like this. And so anyhow, I think that's a great story about how teams with different people can arrive at unique solutions. So I know we all love data and analytics, right? So number two, this is probably the number one issue that I see with my clients. So you don't agree on how you will measure the quality of your service. So design actionable metrics for success are really important. And you might call it engineering actionable metrics for whatever you want. The point is we need to take business objectives down, most of the time down a level to the point where we can go off and build or test against them. The second bullet here, really important. We need to measure outcomes and not outputs. So it's not the code that you put out, it's not the repository, it's not the fact the model's in production. Those are valid engineering goals, but those are not business objectives. What we want is to know what the outcome is that we want from that effort and then try to measure that whether we got there. Benchmarking these key use cases is great if you can, especially if you want to try this and you want to see how it improves. Knowing where you were starting with an existing service and having some way to measure what it's doing now will provide you leverage. If you want to get buy-in to do it more, you can show what that improvement looks like. And then the last one here, because some of these projects I know, like with machine learning and data science, what I like to think of it is like if you're in the lab mindset, you might be designing and crafting to go find a problem that you might be able to solve, and that's a little different than going after a solution. I realize that some of this is about we're not sure what we might learn from the data here, but being able to say that we are in search of a problem and the objective of this is to identify a possible problem that we could solve and not a solution, that is still an outcome. That's a valid outcome, but it's being clear so that when you report to the business, like, what did you guys just do for 4 months? It's like, well, we wrote this model and we put it in production and it did this thing, that it was clear that the goal of it was to identify a problem to solve and not to find a solution yet. So here's a great example. This is a great example of what not to do. Leverage data, and I just made this up. I just tried to sound very executive-like, to use big words like this that don't really mean anything to the people that are supposed to go do something about it. So here is I totally made these up, but if you look at the way these are written, there's clear, you can kind of see an experience that might be there. It's good to have some numbers in there if you can to show quantifiably how you want to change things. There's also, instead of talking about, for example, if you have a model and like maybe it's giving like in the second one, it's giving a recommendation to customer service representatives to say like, I'll give you $20 off your cable bill or whatever. Instead of saying like, we're trying to show that we want to train the model. We want to allow the customer service person to put feedback back into the system to improve the model. But we're doing it in a way where it can be expressed in business terms to someone, to both the team and to the executives, what the value is going to be. So the goal here is someone has to write these stories and these use cases. Sometimes it's a designer, sometimes it's a product manager. Again, typically the product owner or the product manager would be the one to do this. And most of the time, if I ask my clients, like, what are the criteria for this project? This is missing. They can't they can't explain this. And I'm like, I don't know how anyone is going to, what you're going to do is you're going to spend a lot of money and time writing stuff, and it's whatever the technology happens to come out the other end, then we're going to hope that it does something, and you don't have to do it that way. But it does require someone to say that these are acceptable, that these numbers are actually meaningful, and they are the outcomes that the business wants. So, third one, you only track quantitative project success measures if you track anything at all. So the key story here is you can look at time spent in the application, right? Like if you think Google Analytics for web pages and stuff like that, there's lots of quant data that you can collect about applications and whatnot. What's really important, though, is you're not going to learn why and how and people's attitudes about what's in your service if you don't go and talk to them. So it's filling in those whys and hows with one-on-one conversation with customers and one-on-one observation. When I say one-on-one, it can be two-on-one, three-on-one, but usually it's a team, it's a facilitator, usually a designer, a usability researcher, and someone else to take notes, which could be an engineer, an executive, a product manager. But the point is, you're not doing a survey, you're not bringing in 10 users into a room. There are some techniques for that, but if you want to walk out of here with one thing that you can do, it's go talk to individual customers, shadow them if you can, say, can I spend 2 hours with you watching you use this service that we made for you? I just want to observe how you do it, and hear and talk to me out loud, like what's running through your brain as you use it. So, oh yeah, and then the last thing here, probably the most powerful thing that I've seen happen in terms of getting buy-in to change really crappy products is being able to get a stakeholder to participate in one of these sessions. Either show them a highlight reel, maybe you record 3 minutes of, you record the whole thing, but if you find a little money segment in there where it's like, they said something golden, you can send that video clip to an executive, or at least get them in the room. If you see like you've done 3 people, everyone's failing at whatever this software is supposed to do, bring in a business stakeholder and say, hey, could you participate for 30 minutes in this session because you have a good idea the next one's going to fail. And when they watch someone there struggling and you're not helping them, you're not there to help them, you're there to observe and learn, it's when they see that angst, I've never seen something more strong to motivate change in a business. So how long to do it and when, or how often to do it? I would say generally these one-on-one sessions at least every 4 to 6 weeks. More at the beginning when you're creating the designs, a little less as you start to move in. You kind of change you start doing more testing later on with products instead of research to figure out what people need. Theoretically, you should have defined that as you start to create, and then you start to validate the design, which is more of a testing of the design to see whether it accomplished things. But if you're looking for a number and how often to do it, that's how much you should start doing it. And when you stop learning new things, then you'll know as you keep interviewing people, you will know when you keep hearing the same patterns repeating over and over again, you'll know it's time. We have enough data here, let's start making some changes. Number 4, you thought AI, ML would save you. I must put that in brackets because we could just change out that word with whatever the latest hype technology is. Like in 2 years, when I put this slide back up there, it'll say something else with a cool name. So my slide's not changing. So your world is that stuff on the left in orange, right? And we all live this stuff, and it's hard, man. I get it. There's a lot of stuff going on. But for most of us, this boils down to PDFs, web pages, and mobile applications. So like all that stuff you pump in on the backside, the money that you're spending, the effort that you're spending, it's still going to boil down to theoretically and hopefully a useful PDF, a web page, or a mobile app. That last mile, that's the whole user experience happens in that last mile. It doesn't happen on all the stuff on the left side. So if you shortchange that, you put all the investment in the stuff on the left becomes a large risk. So it's something to think about. The point here is the latest technology here is not a panacea. There's always going to be newer, cooler, greater technologies that we can leverage here. So this is not a new thing. We could run this slide 10 years ago and say Ruby on Rails is not going to save our web applications. Like it was the hottest, greatest thing fill in the blank. It's the same thing. That last mile is the human experience, and if you don't focus on that, you're probably not going to deliver value. So number 5, they wanted information, and you gave them data. So this is just a quick little design example here. So you don't need to know a lot about storage, but this is from a UI for a storage company. And what they did is you install their software into your servers, and it starts to offload requests from the disk. And basically what that means is you don't need to go to the disk every time to retrieve data. You put it in memory. Why do you want to do that? Because performance, the speed of the application, tends to run faster the more IOPS you can do. And so this tool, it's a cache, and it basically just prevented sending IOPS to the disk, which is slower than accessing it from memory. And so on the left side, we could tell, you could install the software, load the dashboard, there's no buttons. It was actually one of the funnest things because there was literally, it's just on or off. There were no settings or anything, and it just starts offloading requests. And the measurement of success was how many IOPS did it not have to go to the disk to get? Because if you don't have to go to the disk, you don't have to buy as many drives, right? That's what the actual business value is. You don't need to buy as much storage because we can serve frequent read requests from memory. The reality is that the way a business person thinks about it is like, how many disk drives or racks of shit do I not need to buy? Like that's like, I don't know what 64,000 IOPS costs, but I know what a rack of, from Dell or NetApp or whatever it may be, you know how much the disks cost, right? So this is, again, data and information. The raw data is IOPS. But the measurement of the value to the customer and the guy that's going to take a picture of that dashboard and send it to his boss and say, we should buy this service, he's thinking about it in terms of how many disk drives will we not have to buy. And in this case, it was whatever, it's 21 or whatever the number might be there. So data, information, not the same thing. Number 6, just touch a little bit here on some UI stuff, but information underload is sometimes just as much of a problem. So this is another storage, or it's IT management software for people that manage servers and storage problems. And basically their job is to keep applications running in the business. That's effectively what it runs down to. And this is what they started with. And what we finished with here was adding way more information to the screen, aligned with the way the people that actually manage these systems wanted to use it. So we didn't just suck in all, okay, we can get IOPS, we can get memory usage, we can get CPU, we can get this and that. It wasn't go fish for all the information and put it together when you're trying to figure out why is my application not running fast. What we found out was how does an IT administrator troubleshoot a performance problem? We worked through that step by step to figure out what is their human process that they do today, and then we backed the technology into that. And so what we found out is well, first of all, they want to know, is it going on right now, and how long has it been going on? And basically, that 72-hour mark is really is someone going to be calling me? And then the second thing is, well, is it normally running really bad at this time of day? So I need some historical amount, and we intentionally picked 6 weeks because we knew that 1 month would show business cycles, but in order to see the full cycle, you need a little bit of extra time, so we actually went 1.5 times on the scale to make sure the entire business cycle could be seen. So with an eyeball, they can just scan last 72 hours and then quickly check without navigating to any other screens, what is the cycle? Is this normally bad at this time of day or not? And if it's not, then I know I have a problem. And then the next question is, well, why is it running slow? So I could go and check all these stats, and there's so much data coming out of the data center that might be useful theoretically. Well, reality is they're going to check CPU, memory, storage. There's some other networking. There are some other things which this service didn't have access to in terms of the data. But the point here was we added a lot of data to this screen to make it easier. So removing information is not necessarily the solution. It's the design of the information that matters. It's not the quantity. So information overload usually isn't the problem. It's usually the design of the information that's the problem. So number 7, you require too much tool time analysis for stuff that software should do. So this is from Jared Spool, is a well-known user interface and user experience thought leader, and I borrowed this term that he created, tool time and goal time. So I'm sure you all know what tool time is, and this is a lot of what we talk about when we talk about designing interfaces. It's dragging the widgets around the dashboard, and it's sorting the stuff, and importing and changing time periods, and all this stuff, button clicking and moving stuff around. The reality is that the goals that, or you might have heard of the framework jobs to be done, goals and tasks. The stuff on the right is what people actually want to do when they sit down. And the stuff on the left is all the clicking and stuff that you have to do to theoretically be able to do the stuff on the right. So your job is basically remove as much of the stuff on the left that's required as possible, make great default choices whenever you can, and try to increase the amount of time that people are allowed to spend doing goal time activities in the software. So I can also just say, aim to the right, and it's fun. Even this slide that I've used for a couple of years, that it's actually more and more we're able to really push to the right. It wasn't too long ago that it was hard to push to the right, and the right was kind of a fantasy land. But the more you can think about stuff that you can push to the right side of the screen, and that's one of the great things about prescription and recommendation is the amount of human analysis time and tool time required in the software. Theoretically, hopefully it will go down if we do a good job surfacing the predictions and prescriptions. Number 8, the design is not communicating what you think it is. So this is a trivial example, but you might be able to figure out something in your business where a trivial thing like this isn't so trivial. So this is a project that I did with the Future of Music Coalition. And it's the first large-scale survey on how musicians make money in the United States and what their revenue streams are. Because when you say, oh, musician, what is that, a working musician? No one had a clear definition of what that was. So it's a pretty cool set of data that they had. And they wanted to put it into a dashboard or to a tool that would allow people to go and kind of what we found out was musicians want to go pick the filters and facets that match them. So genre, and when you say musician, do you mean a teacher, an orchestra performer, a jazz performer, a composer, a songwriter, which is not the same thing as a composer? They would code dial themselves in, and then they wanted to see what their group looked like. And one of the interesting things, the point of this slide is that there's a lot of really tiny details that can matter. And so if you look at the section here called income trend over 5 years, the data here is really some words, and there's like one bar chart. And the reason it might look kind of funky, what we found out the users wanted, particularly musicians, was how much more money were other artists like me making from these different areas. So teaching, in this case, teaching and composing are up, and recording sessions, recording a session work, salaried player work, performing was down. And the reason it's designed this way is because it's not showing the amount of additional income they made. It's showing the percentage of respondents who said that that went up at all, whether not how much it went up, but just did it go up or not. And so unfortunately, this is the best we could do because they didn't ever ask the question. They weren't asking survey respondents to talk about how much money did you make from each of these different areas, because chances are musicians don't know because they don't keep really good records about stuff. But we spent a lot of time on this one little thing, which boils down to a bar chart and a table of stuff here to make sure that musicians would not walk away with like, oh, it sounds like people like me, like they made 20.9% more money from teaching. Like, why aren't I making 20.9? How do they get a 21% increase in their teaching salary? That's pretty awesome. That's not, and so trivial for like a public domain kind of project like this, not a big deal. But where in your service might there be places where that kind of conclusion, because design care wasn't given to the presentation of the information, could have a downstream effect in medicine? If you think about medicine, loans, things like this, that could actually affect people's lives. So these details matter, and it's sometimes just you're like, oh, I'm so happy just to get data on the page. It's so, we have a working prototype, and you're like, phew, let's put some color on it and then call it a day. These tiny details matter, and there's a lot of them. Number 8, you didn't take users on a honeymoon. So there are really, when we talk about UX, and this is one of the kind of the differences when we talk about UX and UI, right? User interfaces, those are the things. The user experience is the journey both before you use the thing and the journey that happens after you use the theme. It's kind of like an umbrella, right? And the UI kind of sits under that. And so a lot of times this is the area that gets lost. So mobile applications have done a great job. If you've noticed, a lot fewer of them tend to have like the tour, and you have to go through like 12 screens just to, you're like, I don't care, I don't want your tour. They've gotten better at progressively introducing the experience to you over time. So you can call that onboarding. I think of onboarding as more that one-time kind of setup that's usually gone. But the honeymoon period might be that thing where, hey, we have your thing running, but it's going to take 3 weeks to, gather all this data and do whatever it may be that your application does. But you should identify, is there a difference between how the experience should be or needs to be during that period, whether it's 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Eventually you're going to have the rest of time, which is the majority of the application, but you might need to have a design and experience that's a little bit different between the onboarding part and the rest of time part. So think about whether or not you need a honeymoon experience or not. Some applications don't really need that. It just depends. Number 9, there's 2 more here. You don't build with a product mindset. So I kind of touched on this at the beginning here, but things that I think about with, like, if I was designing internal non-commercial software that I would borrow from kind of the SaaS world, things like notifications on the device that I want to use, whether it's my personal, my phone or my iPad or whatever it may be, giving me a method to provide feedback. Like if you work at some giant corporation, and you're delivering software, why does it have to be send comments to comments@tech.mycorp.com? It's no one believes that any human being reads that stuff. Put a real email address there, or put a chat thing there, or say design team, or better yet, a real email address, and let them, right in the user interface, give you feedback about the product or the application that they're using. So you'll see this, a lot of SaaS products these days have the little drift widget, which is it's basically a chat right in the project that you can get customer service support immediately. So prioritizing the surfacing of value over features creation. So, and this is a good one for engineers, your job is not to give them what they asked for. Our job, and I point you out because a lot of times that's the defense. Now, and I understand why that is. Our job is to give people what they needed. They're not always going to ask for things that are the right things to provide them. Our job is to dig into what's actually needed. So this is, hopefully we don't get to the end and we're having that kind of discussion, because it means we never really identified what the need was to begin with. So we try not to go there if we can. And then allows for appropriate collaboration. So a lot of the stuff we do in business, it's not usually just one person working in complete isolation. So as you design your service, you should think about your customer, but also who are their other, they may have an internal customer themselves. Who is their team? Do they need to escalate a report to their management, which is a totally different line of business than yours? So what is it like for that person that's using your service who has to then report up? Maybe that what I would call a downstream stakeholder, they might have a different need. You might need to go talk to them. They may want to share their views with their colleagues, or maybe their whole group needs to access the application in a certain way. The point is, a lot of the stuff is, I'm not saying it needs to look like Facebook and you should just go put some social stuff in your app. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying go out and find out whether or not you're really dealing with one person at a laptop by themselves that works completely with no one else. You'll probably find that's not the case. And understand what their world is like, and that's what you're going to get out of these one-on-one interviews. Is you're going to understand and empathize what that person's job is like, or if you're working on a SaaS product, what your customer's life is like, and who else they're working with. And then finally here, number 10, your MVP is still just a prototype or proof of engineering effort. So does everyone know what MVP is? It's minimum viable product, and it's kind of came out of the Agile movement, which focuses on working software. And I love Agile. I love the idea of getting to working prototypes quickly. I like to think of MVP as more as minimum valuable product. because really it's about delivering some amount of value. It's not really about a viable product, which sounds like, well, as long as it's bug-free, then we've done some of our job. It's like, no, it's really about value. So do you have a data product, or are you still dealing with a prototype? So some of the like warning signs, and these are not like binary, like it's either right or wrong if you did one of these things, but the data model is surfaced in the nav, or what we call information architecture, which is like, you know, the main navigation and kind of how everything's laid out. This is sometimes okay, but a lot of times it's a warning sign if like literally the database tables have just been put up there and it's like scaffolding and you're still building on that. That's usually a warning sign that something's off, because most humans don't model stuff in like a structured database. Like that's not how human beings typically interact with things, so that's a warning sign. Another one is like when all the navigation feels very noun and object oriented and there's no concept of doing a workflow or performing a goal or a task or an activity. When there's no way to, when I don't see a lot of verbs in the tool or workflows, wizards that, you know, take you step by step through a task that you know they're going to always do this series of events. Whenever they want Y, they have to do X, Y, Z together. They can't just do Y by itself. But if they got to jump all over the place to do X and Z, that's another warning sign. So watch out for those like heavy noun-based, that's a sign. No bridges or connections. Yeah, we just talked about that one. And then the last one is the UX is kind of constrained by a UI framework. So I'm talking about something like Bootstrap. If any of you are familiar with, if any of you are familiar with those, Bootstrap is basically, it came out of Twitter. But it's kind of like you can download a whole bunch of HTML and CSS templates. It has a grid, it has button styles, alert styles, and you can basically load your application into that without writing a lot of the raw underlying HTML and CSS. It gets you going, and it's great. You can skin it and all that. But you can, at some point, if you're letting the framework dictate what the experience is going to be, there's a trade-off there. So if you're heavily relying on Bootstrap to tell you what the limits of your experience should be, you're back to the technology. The technology is dictating the solution instead of the design dictating the solution, where the design, again, ideally represents what the customer wants. So I hope this was useful to you. If you guys go to this URL here, I can send you it will send you an email with a bunch of articles I wrote that go deeper on some of these concepts. And there's also, I have a free guide in here. It's a PDF. It's called the Designing for Analytics Self-Assessment Guide. So it also goes into depth on some of these warning things to look at and how to troubleshoot them. And then here's the URLs there at the top. If you don't want the guide, or you're not interested in the articles, you just want to follow me, I have a mailing list, and I write about once a week to that on topics around design for enterprise data products. And yeah, and my email address and Twitter are there as well. So questions, how do we do on time? 4:50? Oh, we're good.
Cool. So we have time for, let's say, one, maybe two quick questions. Anyone with a hand, I'll bring the mic over to you.
I can repeat it. Tell me your.
Right, good to see you. What are some of your favorite data products besides the New York Times Interact?
What are some of my favorite data products? Well, I guess I think about like one that there's two that I use quite a bit, which is my own data, but because I'm a musician as well, when I'm booking my ensembles, I have a CRM from HubSpot. I don't know if you guys have heard of HubSpot. It's a Boston-based company. They have a terrific experience with their CRM in terms of being able to create your own fields. And then Zapier, I actually learned about Zapier because I was trying to do something with HubSpot that it didn't do. Zapier is another fantastic interface. Like if you don't know how to program, you're not an engineer. That's not really it's sort of a data product. It's definitely an enterprise product. But I think Zapier has a fantastic experience to completely obfuscate the technology part and really help you focus on the user experience that you want without needing to know a lot about coding. So those things come to mind. What else? I don't know. I mean, I look at it, so it's like I look at the stuff for work so much more, but in my I'm not consuming, I guess, large enterprise data products in my personal life so much. So, but you know.
What about analytics design with AR, VR,
I haven't worked in that space before, so I couldn't intelligently comment on that. There is a cool project, I think, it's either Rensselaer or something that I'm interested there, which has to do with music and sound. There's some room that it has to do with big data generating music, so that's something in my head. It's not quite in the AR VR space, but yeah, I'm not as familiar with that space. I'd be curious if you are to tell me afterwards if you know some. I'd love to see it.
We have one more question here.
Just curious, real quick, if you have a comment on Tableau, just like a word or two. What do you think of Tableau as a tool and I mean, it's mostly visualization and this is workflow, but
yeah. So most of my work is not so much with tools for generating visualizations. It tends to be for custom enterprise data products. So I don't use Tableau a lot, but I actually think Tableau is great. I think the level of effort required to get decent looking visualizations now is great. It's fantastic how far that's come and the ability to drag and drop and customize and all this kind of stuff. The downside, I think, to the tools is it's understanding what to use at the right time. It's the same thing for a jazz musician, for a chef, what ingredients go well together. How do you inform the choices of what visuals to use and how to lay it out and all of that? It's like Photoshop. Like I'm a designer, but I use about 20%. I don't even use Photoshop that much, but I use about 20% of that product. I don't even know what 80% of that product does. And it can harm you. You can just start using stuff and shoot yourself in the foot as well. You can also tell the wrong story. But in terms, would I say, okay, well, let's get rid of that and go back to the past? No, absolutely not. I think it's fantastic how easily these tools have come up. And I just saw a really cool data. Jeffrey was 2 sessions ago. What was that project called in GitHub? Something light, Vega. That looked really cool. Another prototyping one, but they've really distilled charting and stuff down to like really basic JSON, like x-axis : price data, y-axis this, color equals that. Outcomes are really, and so they took all these defaults, and effectively, there's no GUI for that. I mean, the output is a GUI, but they thought about the experience, and someone said the one-to-one-to-one mapping of design to code to the way I think about it, and that's absolutely great experience design. They made lots of assumptions about defaults. They didn't ask about grid line color. They didn't ask you about the size. They just made a whole bunch of assumptions in there, and if you want to go and putz around and change it, it's great. It's the same way, the reason I would say with dashboards, like, be really careful about introducing customization of dashboards as a crutch to fix the design problem, because most people are going to accept defaults. Most people don't want to put the effort in, and the assumption is your job, you guys built this stuff, why is it my job to go do the design work? Most people are just going to take the defaults. So if you're going to have customization, make the first requirement, we have to have an amazing default design first, then we will add customization on top of it. So that's, I guess, my shtick on Tableau, and not just Tableau, but all those. So any other quick questions? Yeah.
Do you have any comments on how you can use the design process to maybe influence expectations? So oftentimes, you want to meet a customer's expectation or your client's expectation, but there are limitations to what can be done. And is there something in that process to help align those expectations, or is that?
Do you mean like the technology can't do what they want it to do?
Yeah, like when is this going to be 100% correct?
Well, 100% anything is pretty lofty, but I would say, in my experience, the bulk of problems with design or disagreements on how it should work, it's usually because there wasn't a common and shared understanding about what success looked like at the beginning. Because if you have that, then chances are the design speaks for itself and heads are going like, yeah, that's what I remember you saying and I can see how it's doing that. If you get to the end and there's a lot of arguments and debate about, oh, the button should be here, and oh, why did we make them go through this process again, and da-da-da-da-da, it's usually because alignment didn't happen at the early time. So my thinking is more about let's prevent that problem instead of figuring out how to triage it after the fact. Does that help?
So it starts at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's entirely in the planning phase, because you can't hit a home run if you don't know where the wall is. Like I don't hit a home run. It's like, well, where's the wall? Like, you tell me where the wall is, and then I'll tell you if we can hit a home run or not, or even a base hit. And so a lot of times if that's not defined, and this is good for everybody. The business the management can communicate up. Here are the success criteria for the project, so they're happy. The engineers can see what it is that they're going to need to build. The designers know what the engineers need to go build. They can create the proper assets, and everyone has a shared understanding of how to measure it by doing testing and research of the solution or the application that we've designed. We can go out and test it against that stuff. And if it's wrong, great. We learn from the mistake and we figure out, wow, actually what people really wanted to do is X, Y, and Z, so here's what we learned from that. But the fact is you learn something. It's not a mushy, design, which one is right, and it's all mushy. It's like, no, you can put really strict criteria around pass-fail about what that means. You just have to have that collective understanding, and someone has to do that corralling of all the different interests, So, anyone else? Bueller? Are we asleep? No.
Well, I think we've come to the...
Are we at the end? All right.
Yes,
well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming.